Hey guys, Connor here today with the World Divide. Today I'm in my coffee shop up in Westover, right here. I'm just sipping coffee, hanging out. Things have really slowed down. I'm kind of in a seasonal area, so all the leaves are kind of off, but the snow hasn't come yet. This is a ski town, so yeah, it's dead right now. But today I would like to talk about the Russo-Ukraine War. Today is October 28th, 2022. I kind of want to reiterate or go over some of the events that have happened leading up to this point. Right now, there's really not much to say on the front lines as far as movements, anything like that. There's just a lot of fortifications being built up by Russian side. There are claims on the Russian side that Ukraine's developing a dirty bomb to start a provocation in Ukraine to what the Russians say bomb the Kakova Dam on the Dnieper River and flood the Kherson region to cut Russian troops off from their bridgehead on the left side of the Dnieper River. Because remember, largely the conflict is taking place on the eastern side of the Dnieper River. So, the reason the Russians are in the place that they are now, the reason that they even had to retreat at all, was because in the middle of August, a lot of the contract troops that were assigned to fight in Ukraine, their contracts went up. They were extended 6 months so that way they could participate in the special military operation. But around the time that those contract troops left Ukraine, around that same time, through the summer, Ukrainian forces had been training in multiple different NATO countries, and a lot of those forces had come back to Ukraine to start their own operations. So that gave Ukraine the perfect opportunity to start counteroffensives. They first tried in Kherson, which they at first largely failed at. They then tried counteroffensives in the Kharkiv region, which found a lot more success. The Ukrainians were able to push Russia out of the Izium bridgehead. They were able to push them out of Balaklia, Kupiansk. And so what that allowed them to do was to prevent Russia from forcing more pressure on eastern Kharkiv, by forcing pressure on Sloviansk, Kramatorsk. The Ukrainians were even able to push the Russians out of the Liman bridgehead and force the Russians to hold a line running from Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, through Kremenai, all the way up to Svatova, east of the Oskil River. So now Russian forces are placed relatively far away from Kharkiv, and Kharkiv is in relatively safe hands at the moment. But what the Russians have been doing now is they've been changing their tactics in the war. After the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and after Ukraine had this dealt the successful blow to Russia, all the regions within Ukraine ended up holding referendums to join Russia. Whether those are sham referendums or not, you could debate all day about it. But in the end, it doesn't matter because these regions became part of Russia. And what that did was that changed the situation on the battlefield. Before, the Russians were playing things like they had kind of in Syria. Syria was the main force fighting on the ground. The Russians would provide logistical support, air support, intelligence, some troops on the ground, things of that nature. It was similar to that, but on a much larger scale in Ukraine. The DPR and the LPR forces were the ones heading the operation, with the Russians being the supporting character in the background, not the main force involved in the operation. But that all changed when all those territories became part of Russia. There's now a new military commander assigned to the special military operation. Sergei Surovikin. He's known as more of kind of a ruthless, brutal commander. He's been involved in operations in Syria. He directly headed the operation that caused the fall of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. which is by far, I'd say, the Russians' biggest victory so far in this conflict. And now you're seeing a lot more of a cohesive buildup of forces on the Russian side, all along the Ukrainian border, running from Belarus all the way down to Kherson. All the mobilized forces that the Russians called up are now part of the military. They're just finishing up their training, and they're being deployed on the front right now. So we kind of have this quiet period where there's some skirmishes, there are some things happening, artillery duels, recon and combat, things of that nature, but nothing groundbreaking, no large milestone movements on the front line. What we're also seeing is cooperation between Russia and Iran on a much larger scale than we had seen previously. There was news that the Russians were buying Iranian drones, that they were buying them en masse, kamikaze drones, reconnaissance drones, things of that nature. And what the Russians have been doing is using these drones in combination with cruise missile strikes. And since the Kharkiv counteroffensive, they've switched their tone from kind of an artillery war of attrition to a logistics war. The Russians started targeting substations, electrical stations, lines connecting nuclear power plants all around Ukraine. And so Ukraine has been having huge problems with rolling blackouts. They've been having problems with logistics. Because both sides, Ukraine and Russia, because there are such large swaths of territory to cover, and you have to be able to move troops, you have to be able to move equipment quickly around. By far the cheapest and the quickest way to do that is by rail, and that is how both sides have been setting up their offensives. They've been moving around troops and equipment. But if the power's down, Ukraine can't operate the rail lines necessary to move troops and equipment around. And of course, the Ukrainians have dealt blows to Russians' logistics as well. Take the attack on the Kerch Bridge, for example. An operation that was not only involving Ukraine itself, but direct U.S., UK intelligence as well to help them carry out this operation. And so the Russians have been forced to kind of change their tune to match, to respond. And now what you're seeing is Ukraine also potentially, this is a Russian claim, developing a dirty bomb to start a provocation in Ukraine. They're also undergoing another wave of mobilization. And they have a severe lack of air defense systems. Russia's been targeting air defense systems, they've been targeting substations with these drones, with these cruise missiles, and been dissecting Ukrainian defenses over time. So, where we are right now, I would say this is the calm before the storm. I think that for the entirety of this war, we have seen Russia holding back. We have seen Russia with its gloves on, not using its capabilities to its full extent. And in fact, the characteristic of it being a special military operation has, in fact, limited the Russians to not being able to let out their full capabilities to do what they need to do to win the conflict. But we're going to start to see that. Right now, in the current stage of the operation, current time of year, in fact, in the autumn, the ground is soft now. You have the autumn rains, making dirt roads, making fields almost impassable. And with the Russians more focused on a defensive posture, more focused on logistics, preparation, build-up, the Russians are reinforcing their positions and preparing for this next great counteroffensive. We don't exactly know where this counteroffensive is going to come from. There are large troop buildups in Belarus, so there is a very high risk of an offensive, of new front being opened up in that direction. But I also think, particularly in Kherson region, civilians are currently being evacuated from there because of the Kakhovka Dam dirty bomb threat. The Russians are using this as an excuse to evacuate civilians. But if you also look at the number of troops that the Russians want to send to the Kherson region, they want to have 150,000 troops on the left bank of the Dnieper River, out of the 300,000 that they've mobilized and trained. Well, there isn't really much space for a troop buildup like that to take place in Kherson without them being targeted and picked off. So what's happening is you get rid of the civilians in Kherson, you get rid of all the logistical problems of transporting civilian food, equipment, things of that nature across. With the difficulties the Russians have been having with logistics of supplying Kherson, if they can just utilize and focus on supplying their military, if they can just use all the homes, all the buildings in Kherson for military purposes, they can turn Kherson into a military launching point in the future when the ground hardens, all their forces are there, and they can start this operation. So what you've seen in a response on the Ukrainian side is the evacuation of the city of Mykolaiv of civilians. There are preparations on that side. So if we're going to see things heat up, expect it to happen in that region. And it has been one of the stated goals that Russia does want to take Odessa and Mykolaiv. What would that allow them to do? Well, it would cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea. Odessa is a major port in Ukraine. If that was cut off, a huge chunk of their economy would be sliced off. But what it would also do is it would connect Russian territory with the breakaway pro-Russian region of Transnistria in Moldova, which the region of Transnistria borders the Odessa region. So they're all kind of in line with each other. So if we were to see a big operation, I would say this would be one of the prize targets. Another possibility is an offensive that would happen west of Kiev that would put pressure on the supply roads going through Kiev from Poland, Western weapons that have been supporting and allowing this war to continue thus far. If the Russians were able to reduce the amount of Western arms that get to the front, create another front line, that would severely put pressure on Ukraine and force them to the negotiating table, which is ultimately the goal, is to try to force Kiev to the negotiating table. But at this point, escalatory actions have been taken so far that I don't believe there is any chance of Ukraine surviving this war. So that's where we are right now. We're in a quiet period where there's not really much information coming around. But Russia is changing their stance, they're changing their tactics, and they will be back for another offensive. It's just a matter of when, and time is on the Russian side. Alright, thank you guys. I will keep an eye on the situation. I was just going to kind of give a day update today, but there really is not much to talk about. I could just talk about skirmish here, piece of land being taken here, all of that. But I think it's better to talk about kind of the bigger picture and what the situation has brought for us to be to this point. To this point where we're on the brink of World War III, with how brash and idiotic we've been and careless with our economic war of attrition against Russia. So we'll see what happens. I'm gonna keep you guys in tune, and see you in the next video. Bye bye.